Welcome, everybody. I'm going to make sure that everybody gets situated in our classroom, and we will begin. It's a bit bittersweet today. It is our last session together. And at the same time, we have a very, very exciting session with some amazing guest speakers and talking about one of our favorite topics, the social determinants of health. So just to give you a sense of what's happening today, we're going to spend the first 2 hours with our amazing panelists, and we'll be hearing some formal presentations from each of them, and we'll have an opportunity to do some Q&A. And then after we do all of that, then we will have some of the faculty from the course get together with you and close out the course, or at least this phase of the course, because of course we have post July training. Okay, so why don't we get started? Again, welcome, great to see everybody. Excited about today. Today is the second big session where we're focusing exclusively on social determinants of health. And we have some amazing thinkers from the field who really contributed to the field on social determinants of health, pushed the boundaries of the field of the social determinants of health, still pushing those boundaries. And it's really amazing to have two fabulous women with us today. So I'm going to introduce them separately, and I'll introduce them right before they do their formal short presentations. And our first speaker that I want to introduce is Dr. Rachel Hardeman. She is a reproductive health equity researcher, and she applies the tools of population health science and health services research to elucidate the critical and complex determinant of health inequity, racism. And she does so in a way that leverages the frameworks of critical race theory, which we've been hearing a lot about in the news, and reproductive justice to inform her equity-centered work, which aims to build the empirical evidence of racism's impact on health, particularly for Black birthing people and their babies. Dr. Hardeman conducts partnered research, in particular with Roots Community Birth Center in North Minneapolis, one of 5 Black-owned freestanding birth centers in the US. Her work also examines the potential mental health impacts for Black birthing people when living in a community that has experienced the killing of unarmed Black persons by police. Needless to say, she's an incredibly accomplished academic scholar with tenure at the University of Minnesota Public Health. She's an endowed professor and founding director of the Center for Anti-Racism Research and Health Equity. She's won numerous awards and published many high-impact peer-reviewed articles. Dr. Hardeman's research has elicited important conversations on the topics of culturally centered care, police brutality, and structural racism as fundamental cause of health inequities. Her overarching goal is to contribute to a body of knowledge that links structural racism to health in a tangible way and identifies opportunities for intervention and dismantles the systems, structures, and institutions that allow inequities to persist. So at this point, I will hand over the podium to Dr. Hardeman, and we'll hear from her.
Muted. Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me to join you all today. I'm really pleased and excited to be here. I am going to spend just about 15 minutes talking about some of the work that I'm doing and how I'm thinking about the social determinants of health right now in my work. And then I really look forward to a conversation and questions and answers along the way. So my presentation is brief on purpose because, again, I think that interaction is sort of most valuable. I always want to thank my collaborators. Too many to name, but the work does not get done alone, certainly. And I don't have anything to disclose for this particular presentation. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of framing and background. So first, I think it's important to say that, I stand on the shoulders of many scholars, right, who have done the work of documenting racial disparities, talking about health disparities and health equity. Dr. Braveman, my co-panelist today, is actually one of those people whose work I was reading in grad school, and it has certainly shaped my thinking and my scholarship in the field. So thank you, Dr. Braveman, for all that you have done for us in the health equity space. I entered the field of, so I'm trained as a health services researcher. I focused on the sociology of health and illness and really thinking about how do we take that social context and apply it to health research, healthcare delivery, and health policy, right? And really thinking about the fact that they're all inextricably linked in many ways. And I entered the field of health policy and health services research at a time when we were being taught that race was a risk factor for health and well-being, and the analytic methods are often incorrectly presented racial categories as these immutable biological facts, right? Failing to acknowledge that racism and not race cause observed disparities. And so in our quest to sort of tackle and understand racial disparities in that time, we were often taught to insert race variables into models and analyses without interrogating what those variables actually meant, which, has been problematic for a number of reasons that we can, certainly discuss. But, while some of these things still happen, I think we have shifted tremendously in the past few years into a new understanding, one that doesn't just put race forward as a risk factor, but really an understanding of racism as a fundamental cause of health inequities. And so that's that red dot on the spectrum is, I think, where we are, and we're shifting into the space that I'm really excited about, and the work that I'm doing and the work that those working with me in my research center are doing is really around exploring how do we then measure racism and really elucidate the mechanisms behind it in an effort to get to that end goal of dismantling racism. So to sort through all of that, I want to take a step back for a second. I'm not going to, spend a ton of time actually, or any time really, talking about the social determinants of health, because I know that's the framework that you all have dug into over the course of your time together. So just as a reminder, we're talking about the fact that where we live, where we're born, live, learn, work, play, worship, etc., matters for our health and well-being. So here's the connection I want us to make and the question I want us to consider today. And that is, why do the social determinants matter for health? So why is it that where we work, where we live, where our children play, why does that matter for health? What is it about our society that's made it such that our access to material resources and goods like housing and education matter for health and well-being? And, the big question is, and does it have to be that way? Spoiler alert, no, it doesn't, right? I think we would all be on the same page with respect to that. So when I think about the question of why do the social determinants matter for health, I think it's important to think about the historical context. So we know, again, that where someone lives matters for health. I'm sure we've all seen or led or participated in many of the incredible studies that have looked at zip codes showing life expectancy from, one zip code to the next. Or even some of my recent work shows that living in certain neighborhoods puts one at greater exposure to police surveillance, and that disproportionately high police surveillance was found to be associated with preterm birth here in Minneapolis. So where we live, neighborhood context, one of those social determinants of health matters for our health and well-being. But how did that come to be the case, right? And one of the reasons behind that is redlining. So the act of literally drawing lines on maps to separate those hazardous and declining, quote, neighborhoods from those that were considered to be sort of the most desirable or best neighborhoods. And what that did was created codified patterns of racial segregation. It created patterns and disparities in access to credit and home loans and mortgages. And it resulted in a differential pattern in home ownership rates and home values as well. So historical redlining is a form of structural racism that's showing up and that has showed up in policies and practices around housing. And even today in 2021, it's still very apparent where these boundaries were drawn, and we can actually map COVID data onto redlining maps. So this, I know it's hard to see because it's actually meant to be interactive. So if you go to the link on this, the slide, you can look up your city and use sort of the interactive maps. It's really cool, but to kind of get a sense of what's happening. But this is just a screenshot from my hometown of Minneapolis. And what we can see is that the history of disinvestment can be traced to the 20th century when residential segregation was imposed in formalized ways. And that segregation was implemented using, again, redlining, as well as, what we've seen in Minneapolis, thanks to some incredible historians over the past 5 years who have diligently been tracking every home that has a racial covenant on it, meaning that it was written into law that that home cannot be owned by a Black person or a person of color. We see that, we have this history of zoning regulations, even public health codes, and again, that sanctioned redlining. And so what we see on these maps in the pink areas are the predominantly Black neighborhoods in Minneapolis. And when I look at the data for COVID morbidity, when I look at the data and the maps for preterm birth, for who has highest risks of asthma and COPD and diabetes and hypertension, they all map directly onto those pink areas. So going back to that initial question that I put out there, why do the social determinants matter for health? So we have to consider the root cause as why they matter for health, and that is structural racism. So, what I just showed you is this example of redlining, which is one of the many forms of structural racism that's manifested in our society, which has, through its policies and systems and institutions, has dictated the social context in which people are able to live, where they're able to raise their families, where they're able to get jobs, build a social network, and build a community. So when I refer to structural racism, I think it's important to be clear, we're not talking about an individual person who's doing overtly racist acts. We're talking about a system, the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems of housing, of education, employment, benefits, credit, media, healthcare, policing, criminal justice, and many more. And then these patterns and practices then reinforce discriminatory beliefs, values, and the distribution of resources. What I also think is important to think about as you look at this slide is this diagram that shows with the interaction between implicit bias and structural racism. I always like to make sure that we sort of delineate the two, because I think we've gotten comfortable, which is awesome, as a field of talking about implicit bias, so that this idea that unconscious or automatic biases that allow us to sort of associate stereotypes or attitudes towards different groups of people without our conscious awareness. I think that's incredibly important, but what we have, I think where we struggle is understanding that implicit bias is an important part of structural racism, and we have to be working on both to actually build health equity and address the social determinants of health. So, in my opinion, in order to really lead that meaningful change that I think we all, seek to do, we have to explore implicit bias as part of a larger conversation, right, about how current inequities in our own institutions and organizations and our research and our practice as public health professionals is perpetuating inequities. So to do that, we have to, like I said, when I open this presentation, we're working towards that dot, you see the arrow above, measuring and elucidating the mechanisms. And so in my work, and what I'm really excited about right now, is this idea of operationalizing and measuring structural racism. You know, it certainly has over the past year, I'd say, become an active area of research. And that's not to say work hadn't been done prior to that. There's incredible work that's been done by scholars. I think we're at a point now where we're naming it and being more explicit and engaging in this work, which is really exciting. You know, I think that, you know, by thinking about the social determinants of health as this, and structural racism sort of as the root cause of the social determinants of health, and the two of them sort of being inextricably linked, we can actually now begin the critical work of anti-racist research and anti-racist praxis in public health. And so in my last couple of slides, I think these are my last two slides, I just wanted to give us some things to think about as we think about, and I know not everyone on here is a researcher, many of you are, you know, practicing in the public health field as, you know, public health professionals, but I think the same questions, the same issues apply, right? So there's a lot, you know, we can dig into in the Q&A around this, but what I will encourage you all to think about as public health professionals is, what does anti-racist research, what does anti-racist praxis look like for you? You know, the example I have on this slide is just one of many examples of how we need to shift the framing of how we approach the work in public health. So, you know, what we traditionally would ask as a research question or pose as a research question is something like, you know, what's wrong with people of color, Black people, for instance, that makes them die younger or at higher rates and suffer more illnesses? We often hear, you know, why do Black infants, you know, not survive the first year of life, things like that. And we really need to be thinking about, how do we shift those questions? How do we shift the frame to one that is anti-racist and really centers the fact that we have systems and policies and social structures that have combined to create, or intersect in many ways, right, to create the conditions for poor health? Or even asking, how is it that despite over 400 years of oppression, Black communities of color have actually thrived in many ways, right? So reframing and rethinking the way that we approach the work, whether it's, you know, an intervention, whether it's, you know, developing a program or conducting a research study, I think is incredibly important. And then I'll just close by offering that, you know, we can't do this work without centering at the margins. So what that means is a couple of things. First, it means we have to shift our viewpoint from a majority group's perspective to one that represents marginalized groups, or the groups that are closest to the pain, that are closest to these issues. What we know is that historical and contemporary views of economics, of politics and culture have been informed by centuries of explicit and implicit racial bias and of racism. And as a result, the white experience has been normalized, right? So that becomes our standard. And if we are able to and willing to center at the margins and really take a step back and allow the folks who can speak from the lived experience lead the work, we are ultimately not going to be successful in our efforts to address issues around the social determinants of health, around structural racism and achieving health equity. So I look forward to your questions and the discussion to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hardeman. Very powerful talk with lots of important messages in there, packed in your short talk. I'm going to encourage folks to put some of their questions in the chat. And I think before we move to Dr. Braveman's talk, maybe we'll have a few questions. And I'll begin, but I'll look at the chat to see what you all have to ask of Dr. Hardeman. In your talk, I think you began to touch on challenges in this field on the social determinants of health, and looking at racism in particular as a key determinant of health. But I'm wondering if you can either expand a little bit more on some of those challenges that you mentioned, for example, at the end, how we ask the right questions in order to advance our understanding of racism and health, or even how we do a better job of kind of centering at the margins, or any other key challenges that you think we need to put more effort towards solving at this time?
Yeah, I think that's a, I think we could talk all day about that, right? I, I mean, one of the things I think is incredibly important, and something, I think about a lot because of Dr. Braveman's work around language and defining like like what equity is versus inequities versus equality. And I think one of the challenges I see is that we have not, as a field of public health, coalesced around sort of a strong glossary or language for these issues, right? And so I think structural racism, systemic racism, and they get used interchangeably, or they mean different things to different people. And so I think we have, and I see that in the practice space as well, as I am engaging with the work of, so my research center, we're working on building community partnerships right now and thinking about the issues that we want to tackle, and often find that we're not always talking, using the same language there as we are engaging in those relationships. And so I think that's an incredibly important challenge that we need to move to the forefront of the discussion. And I mean, I think related to that, it's like, it's a comfort level with naming racism, right? And so, I think we've gotten really far with talking about the social determinants of health, but we haven't really clearly stated all the time that the social determinants are a manifestation of structural racism, right? And so being able to sort of have that conversation very openly, I think is a challenge and an opportunity that I would focus on.
Yeah, thank you. On that issue of language, I have just a short follow-up. I'm wondering if you think the terms health equity, health inequities that we talk so frequently about in academic settings, if that's sort of common language with community partners.
Oh, that's such a great question. I would say it depends on the partner, right? I think a lot of I have a lot of community partners who are also clinicians, like the midwives, and doing work, community-based practice. And for them, absolutely, that language means something, but I think they approach it from a similar lens and training, right? But there's also people who, I just, well, I guess not just, about 2 years ago, wrapped up a study where we were doing qualitative work with Black women of reproductive age who were living in the communities where Jamar Clark and Philando Castile were shot and killed by police officers, right, in the Twin Cities. And I mean, it was very clear that the language that we needed to use with community members and having those sort of focused discussions and community conversations was very different, than the language that, I think I would even have used in this presentation. So it's something that we have to be really thoughtful about. And it's something that, we thought we had been thoughtful about it initially, and then realized after one community conversation that that more work was needed to be done, even in saying like, what does structural racism mean to you? Like, how do you see that? People can't answer, especially I think when you're talking to a community where it's their day-to-day and their lived experience, it's the water you swim in. So how do you actually even name that? So, but that's a whole nother issue too. So.
Okay, thank you. I see a question in the chat. I'll just read it out from Nicole. Are there existing measures of experienced racism that you recommend for use in public health settings? Followed by, do you think we need to develop better measures? And if so, what characteristics would you like to see in measures developed in the future?
This is a great question. I think that folks like Dr. David Williams and others, Nancy Krieger, have developed some incredible measures around sort of experiences of discrimination and perceptions of discrimination and racism, the everyday discrimination scale and things like that have been incredibly valuable in moving us to this point. And now where I see us needing to go, and the work I'm working on, I'm deeply involved in writing a grant right now. And also, we have a few publications forthcoming that have developed, where we've piloted a measure that we've developed called the multidimensional measure of structural racism, where, the idea is, again, if you think about the definition I offered in my presentation, which is the totality of ways that all of these different social determinants, right, are interacting to perpetuate inequity, how do we capture that in an index and a measure And so, my center and is we're working on that quite a bit right now, and have found that it has some interesting predictions for vaccine. We've used it as a tool to predict vaccine equity in New York. So that work is forthcoming in a couple of weeks, and also are looking at how it predicts preterm birth in Minnesota right now. But I think there's so much space to develop better measures. I'm a firm believer that if we don't value what we don't measure, and we can't change what we don't measure, right? And so, one of the other pieces of the work I'm doing right now is building out a data repository of measures of structural and institutional racism, with the idea that they would be for public use, right? So that community organizations, departments of health could come and leverage that data or whatever variables they needed based on sort of what their interests were, so that we could all accurately answer the question, how is racism operating here?
Thank you. Are there particular characteristics of those measures
that you're
developing or that you'd like to see for future measures?
I mean, it's hard, right? So we've done a lot of community conversations around how to talk to folks about how structural racism shows up in their lives, because I think community engagement needs to be part of the ways that we're operationalizing it. And that's not always clear. So I think there are certain characteristics. I don't want to, I could spend all day talking about this. So certainly things that feel perhaps like mundane or like not that interesting, but like fees and fines, right? Like government ticketing, the way that we fine people for, infractions and things like that, and how that sort of compounds, over time. Is one place that I think there's a great scholar, Bridget Davis, who's at Harvard, who's doing some work in that space. I also think that we have to be thinking about the historical context too, that this work can't be ahistorical. And so even thinking about how do we pull in, I mentioned that Minneapolis has done an incredible job of tracking the racial covenants on houses in the city, and being able to capture sort of the historical data, I think, is just as important as capturing data that's sort of more contemporarily relevant.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, looking at the chat. All right, I don't see any other comments there yet. Maybe I'll ask you, although you kind of touched on this, I'm wondering if you have anything to add about the methodological approaches you find most useful when both conceptualizing social determinants of health and studying social determinants of health.
I would say, generally speaking, mixed methods. I feel like we can't rely only on, large data sets and data points to really understand what's happening. And so I think taking a mixed methods approach is incredibly important. I think that, and some of the work we're also doing is really in the policy analysis space, right? To think about, because when we're talking about the social determinants of health, we're talking about the intersections of social and health policy. And so we are trying really hard to kind of think about how we engage in sort of methodologies that allow us to kind of both dissect policy that currently exists to understand sort of from an equity lens, is it useful, is it harmful, a lot of unintended, how do we capture those unintended consequences?
And then I know that you use critical race theory in your work. I'm wondering if you could say a few words about that approach.
Yeah, so I think critical race theory sort of at its core is incredibly important, because it starts us out with a baseline understanding that sort of racism is embedded in the fabric of our society, right? It's the water, again, that water we swim in. Kind of highlights what critical race scholars will call like the ordinariness of racism, right? It's just there, it just is. And then it requires, and this is, building on like the incredible work of Dr. Chandra Ford, who has taken critical race theory and applied it to public health in a way that allows us to create research and design research that first and foremost names, racism as a fundamental cause of health inequities and names that sort of ordinariness, and allows a research team even to have conversations about sort of the biases that they bring. I think we often do that on the qualitative side, but not on the quantitative side, right? And so folks don't realize that even making a decision about whether you're going to do a logistic regression instead of, a hierarchical regression, right? Whatever it might be, there's bias in that decision. And so I think the sort of practical side of critical race, public health critical race praxis allows for those discussions to happen and for those things to be named as you work through the research process. And then the other piece of it is the one that I sort of ended my presentation on, which is the centering at the margins piece, which I think is probably the most critical.
Thanks. Maybe I'll just follow up with a very practical question. Since you, Dr. Hardeman, can't be at all of our research tables, who is important to have as part of our teams if we wanted to do more critical race theory practicing in our work?
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely have to have someone on your team that understands the methodology deeply and can converse about it. And I also think, what critical race theory or public health critical race praxis would say is that, a majority of the folks on your team need to be able to identify with the lived experience that you're studying, right? And for those who aren't, and it's okay if not everyone can, that's completely fine, but you also have to be able to name that. And so we've used it in the work we've done with Roots Community Birth Center. We've had a partnership with them for about 5 years now, and have really intentionally engaged in the practice of that methodology throughout the process. And I think it's allowed us to, even as we get results and we're talking through things or have a conflict, it's allowed us to have this foundation of openness and vulnerability that I think it can be really incredibly powerful and important when you're doing health equity work.
Yeah. I really appreciate, we've talked a little bit here over the last couple of weeks about engaging with communities and how that can provide an important perspective and much more, as you're referring to. How do you think we can do a better job of involving underrepresented communities in our project teams? And do you think we also need to be practicing critical race theory in order to do that well?
Yes, and yes. I think, and we like to talk about the pipeline issue and the fact that there's not enough of a pool of which I struggle with that, because I think it's a both and, right? The pipeline takes a long time, but in the meantime, there are plenty of folks who, and I'm thinking about it from a research team lens, but certainly this is applicable across, all sorts of public health work. But I think that there's opportunities to engage people and compensate them for their time and their expertise. And it requires that we shift how we define expertise, right? So, the expertise could be living in XYZ community as a Black man who has experienced, whatever it is. And that's the expertise that you need to bring to the table. And we can value that, and we can compensate people for their time and bringing that to the table, and creating space for that relationship with that work to happen.
Yeah, I so appreciate that comment. I know we ran into problems when we tried to hire members of community, maybe who don't have formal graduate degrees. And so we've had to push back on our HR to let them know that, lived experience counts as expertise, and have been working with them. They're slow learners, have been working with them to figure out how to count that and compensate for that lived expertise when we hire.
Yeah.
I see a new question in the chat, and it's from Sarah, who appreciated the arc of change about how we've been able to understand and maybe unlearn some of the wrong lessons that we've had in racial disparities in health. And she realizes that much of her early training in public health was outdated and wrong. Given that, do you have recommendations about how to reframe our programmatic work while we're working within institutions that have historic and current structural racism?
Oh man, that's such a great question and a really hard one. Because that's, I mean, I think that's the like crux of the issue, right? Is that we are working, we're sort of all cogs in these big, parts of these larger institutions that may have a long ways to go in the work that they're doing. And we're trying to figure out sort of how to affect change in our respective sort of spaces. I think that, the way, and I talk about this in a paper that I published in the journal Health Services Research with one of my doctoral students. And we were specifically talking about the field of health services research and this idea of we call it, the title is Examining Racism in Health Services Research, a Disciplinary Self-Critique. But one of the things we talk about there is this need for reframing and, kind of exploring how do you reframe from sort of this white racial frame or, to one that feels anti-racist. And I think it starts with a lot of personal, certainly the personal self-reflection and things like that. But also it's, maybe picking that one, maybe it's one part of your mission or goal or objective to sort of focus in on as to reframe, right? So it could be, I was trying to think of a quick example off the top of my head, but I'm not coming up with one. But I think it's focusing on that sort of one thing that you think you can change, that you think you can reframe, and working from there to say, okay, how do we ask this differently, or how do we approach this differently? Analyzing, do we have the right people at the table? Do we have the right team assembled? If we don't, why not? And also, how do we do that? And sort of walking through all of those processes in a thoughtful and engaged way, I think is part of the first steps there as you're kind of navigating it within your own institution.
Okay, thank you. I realize that I missed a question in the chat, so let me go back.
Sure.
This is from one of the faculty, Dr. Michael Kramer. He says he would have asked himself verbally, but his sound is inconsistent, so he's posing it in the chat.
Awesome.
And wonders if you could comment on the sequence of tasks in your graphic that has dismantling racism, following measuring racism and understanding mechanisms. Are these necessarily linked in this way, or might they be two complementary goals that reinforce one another? Our understanding of mechanisms could be informed by the efforts at dismantling and changing, and vice versa.
I don't disagree with that. I think that's interesting. And this also not to say suggest that it's a very super linear process, because it's not, right? And also between each of those dots, there's so many other things that have to happen. I think one of the things I think about a lot with the current work I'm doing around the measurement piece is, and I struggle with this, to be honest, because I talk a lot about the need to develop these measures and the work we're doing to develop measures, but also, right, if we shifted the idea of whose evidence we think is real and whose evidence we value, and just went out, walked outside our doors and asked people what's happening, I think we would have the answers. We wouldn't need the measures, right? I wouldn't need to do the empirical analysis and put it in front of policymakers and people who can affect change. And so, so I think, yeah, it's a yes, it's a both and for sure.
Thank you. Let's see if there are other questions. Maybe I'll just kind of follow up that one about mechanisms, because I think we're so great at epidemiology and demonstrating associations between factors, and less good at revealing these mechanisms. Yeah. And I think until we understand those mechanisms, we won't know how to make change. And so I'm wondering, how do you approach that? Is that something that you do quantitatively, or is that something you do qualitatively, or is it another mixed methods approach?
Yeah, that's the hardest part of this work, like you just said. I mean, I think the most success comes from qualitative work that sort of, digs into the mechanisms. And it's something I've just been thinking a lot about on the quantitative side. And if that's like, and who knows if that's even necessary, right? I don't know that, I'm not convinced that like we have to do that quantitatively. But I think it's a piece of this work that is has sort of the biggest like gaping hole for sure.
For what it's worth, some of the ways in which we've looked at the mechanisms of social protection policies in our work is we've turned to realist approaches, because that really is all about advancing theory and why things happen and how. So again, it's a whole other area that you have to learn if you want to do that well. But that is one way in which we've handled it, and it's definitely not quantitative the way we've done it. So let's see, I'm just going to do a quick time check, and I'm wondering, we will have some time at the end to continue questioning, because I still have questions for you, Dr. Hardeman.
Awesome.
Maybe I will move to hearing from Dr. Braveman at this point, so that we can hear her formal presentation as well. And so I'll just let everybody know that if you have more questions about the social determinants, about racism as a social determinant, please continue to put them in the chat. And what I'm going to do now then is introduce Dr. Braveman. Dr. Braveman has been studying the social determinants of health for over 30 years. She has studied and published extensively on health equity, health disparities, racism and racial disparities, and other social determinants of health. And she's worked to bring attention to those issues both domestically and internationally. Her research focuses on measuring, documenting, understanding, and addressing socioeconomic and racial and ethnic disparities in health, particularly maternal and infant health. She's collaborated broadly on this area, for example, with the World Health Organization staff in Geneva to develop an initiative on health equity in low and middle income countries. And she's directed research for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Commission on the Social Determinants of Health. Throughout her career, she's collaborated with local, state, national, and international health agencies to see rigorous research translated into practice for greater health equity. She too is an accomplished scholar and academic, professor of family and community medicine, and the founding director of the Center for Health Equity at the University of California, San Francisco. So we will be hearing from Dr. Braveman now, and I promise to assist with the slides. So let me see if I can adjust my technology here. And Dr. Braveman, I hope you're ready to go, and let me just put your first slide up.
I am indeed ready to go, and it's a real pleasure to be participating in this. I think maybe a drink of water will help the raspiness in my voice a bit. It's particularly a pleasure to have had the chance to hear Dr. Hardeman's outstanding presentation. I really appreciate that. Yes, and this slide is the one that I want to have up. Yeah, that's the one. So I want to focus these remarks on the notion that understanding the social determinants of health is crucial for understanding how racism damages health. And another way to frame this is that racism is a social determinant of health. It's one of the most powerful social determinants of health. So I want to start by showing you this slide that depicts how one form of racism, I think the most the most destructive, albeit often hidden, form of racism, that is systemic racism, systemic or structural racism. I will often just use systemic to refer to both structural and systemic, since the structures are part of they are the scaffolding of the systems that are implicated, that perpetuate racism and racial disparities in health and well-being. So I wanted to start by showing you this slide that's an attempt to depict how systemic racism damages the health of people of color step by step. The steps that I've called out here are not, this is not the only way, I think, to describe what the sequential steps are that are involved in the destructive effect of systemic racism on health, but it's one way of looking at it. And so in this, you'll see at the top of the large bars there, each one of these headings. So first is this bar represents systemic racism. So it represents the systems and the structures such as laws and policies and established beliefs and practices, the systems and structures that have discriminatory effects. So that's systemic racism. And then what that leads to is differential access to resources and opportunities, and specifically differential access to the resources and opportunities that are crucial for health. And then that in turn, that differential access to resources and opportunities leads to exposure to health harming experiences or to lack of health promoting experiences, which then kicks into action the biological mechanisms, which then manifest as the worse health. So now let me break it down just a little bit more. So let's look back at the first bar on systemic racism. And here I've just listed a number, and certainly not all, unfortunately, just a number of examples of systemic racism. Dr. Hardeman talked about racial residential segregation, and that has been a fundamental determinant of health that wrecks its damages through multiple steps. So what does it do when you have racial segregation? Then you can have laws, unfair laws that make school funding largely dependent on local property taxes, and you have effectively suffocated the educational opportunities of people in racially segregated areas, because these are areas where opportunities have been cut off, the lifeline in so many ways, including economic disadvantage. And that's the economic disadvantage I've put in that sort of next category as an example of a result of the systemic racism. Another I think example of systemic racism that's also a very important one, and that intersects with how racial residential segregation works are the long documented history of unfair financial systems and financial structures that have squeezed people living in segregated areas. And Dr. Hardeman mentioned redlining, and that's one of the one and a very salient example of those. So that the racial segregation, in light of other examples of systemic racism, such as the unfair financial systems or structures, then results in lack of economic disadvantage, and including a lack of access to wealth, to building wealth and home ownership, that these unfair lending practices that have exploited segregated communities for a very, very long time, for decades and more, that these unfair lending practices have cut people off from the possibility of accumulating wealth. So they can't, it cuts them off from the possibility of home ownership. That then means that if there's not much wealth, there's not much home ownership in a segregated area, your local property taxes are not going to be very large, and your schools are going to be under-resourced. And so that all those disadvantages then lead to lack of educational opportunity for the next generation. And this is a really important cycle that gets perpetuated, and how systemic racism in a number of forms, but particularly the residential segregation and the unfair financial systems and structures, how that gets perpetuated. If we look at the next bar, the health harming or lack of health promoting exposures or experiences, the chronic stress is listed there as a well-known consequence of financial strain. So that the lack of economic opportunity, constantly having to cope with daily challenges in the face of inadequate economic resources, is a source of chronic stress. And we know now from neuroscience that chronic stress, even if it's not very dramatic, but if it's chronic, something about it being relentless and chronic, even at a sort of a relatively low level, seems to be what it is that damages health the most, that what kicks off the neuroendocrine processes. Now I'm in the final bar there, the neuroendocrine processes that lead to inflammation, that lead to immune system dysfunction, that make people more vulnerable to infection, that affect their vascular health, and that can have epigenetic effects that can be, even though these are not, they don't get incorporated into the DNA, we have learned that they can be transmitted from one generation to another. Now, let me just show you the next slide, please. Okay, so let's just think of what I've been emphasizing to a certain extent is how systemic racism has resulted in crushing educational opportunities for people of color. And then just think for a minute about how education can affect health. This first slide, so next, please. Yeah, and next. Go ahead with the thanks. Thanks very much. This is one that I think everybody knows about, how educational attainment can lead to better health through health knowledge and better problem solving and coping skills, enable one to control one's diet. And now the next slide, please. Okay, and then go ahead with the animations. Yeah, just go ahead. That's great. That's great. But this is another set of connections that are supported by literature that support how education can lead to health via its effects on work, and then through work on income and work-related resources and working conditions, and the myriad ways in which income, as well as work in itself, can influence health. And then the final one, please. So here, finally, this shows what we would call the psychosocial pathways from education to health. These slides overlap with each other to some extent, but here the emphasis is on the more on the psychosocial pathways. So how we know how educational attainment then influences social standing, which influences social networks, and both of those influence the resources that we have available to us, our perceived status, the stress that goes along with low social standing. With social networks, they can influence our social and economic resources. Do you have, in your social networks, are there people who have resources that could help you out in a time of need? Or are the people in your social networks all hanging on by their fingernails and they're relying on you? They're constantly relying on you for resources because you're doing better than them, and how that could influence your health. The social networks affect norms, they affect social support, again, stress, and educational attainment, also well known to influence control beliefs, the beliefs whether you can, the extent that you can control what happens to you, and well known that influences coping, and it influences our ability to respond to stressors, which in turn influences health. So the reason that I just showed you these, and now I'd like to go back to the first slide and forget about the final slide that I put there. I've showed you this because I want to make a point that social determinants in general operate through generally long and often complex sequences of forces that play out not over a few years, but generally play out over decades, and sometimes over generations. And systemic racism, as a major, one of the most powerful social determinants of health, is no exception to this, that it operates through these long causal chains. I wanted to show you how education influences health to make a point about the complexity, but those were a gross oversimplification. And this slide that I'm showing you right now about systemic racism leading to worse health among people of color. That is a gross oversimplification, and that for every step along the way that you can see here, there are myriad steps in between, and there are multiple opportunities for interactions among the factors that, either the factors that I've depicted on this diagram, or factors that I have not depicted. So what's my point? It is very challenging to study the social determinants of health, and I think we have to particularly keep and including very challenging to study systemic racism, and some of the some of the challenges, the measurement, but in addition to the challenge of measurement, there is this challenge that the effects are rarely direct, that the effects are happening through these long and generally complex causal chains. And so in our field, we have to gird up our loins and be able to face this without denying it. And we have to insist, for example, that if there are those who would say that the only evidence, worth the term, worth the name evidence, comes from randomized controlled trials. So if you believe that, you have just surrendered the whole, practically the whole field of the social determinants of health. There are times when an RCT can be done on a sub-step, where we can identify a particular piece of a long causal chain. And sometimes an RCT could be done with that, but generally this is not the kind of knowledge that's going to lend itself to that. And then I've just closing and looking forward to the Q&A, just to say that what's really exciting in the field of social determinants of health is that the questions really are no longer about whether social factors are important influences on health. But the questions are about how the social factors operate, and particularly about how to most effectively and efficiently intervene to activate the health promoting pathways and interrupt the health damaging ones. And I think in the struggle against racism, that the people who are in the battle against racism, as in the form of researchers, it's really important to always keep in mind that the length and the complexity of the causal chains that are likely to be involved, and not to, I guess, surrender to some norm for evidence that would make the kind of evidence that we can collect that would make that that would vitiate it. That we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot, but we always want to have this in mind. And just the length of the causal chains alone is a huge enough barrier, and then you add to that, because how often do we as researchers have the funding to study issues over over generations, over decades and generations. So I will stop there and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Braveman. Okay, so wow, I don't know where to start with the questions. I so appreciate your presenting the social determinants of health in all its complexity, even if you weren't able to depict it at the level of complexity that you would like to, because I think it does present challenges for us when we're trying to generate information as epidemiologists to allow others, decision makers and policymakers, to act on that evidence. I'm wondering, when we're thinking about studies and the opportunities that epidemiology presents, what social determinants of health studies or results, given the fact that you've actually worked a lot with local, state, and national, and even international health agencies, what social determinants of health studies and results are most useful and impactful for making changes to the social determinants of health? And what's not useful?
Well, I think that studies that make sure that they express themselves clearly in language that non-scientists can understand have a much greater likelihood of influencing policy, and that's a mistake we often make, is that, sort of with each other, it's like the more complicated our language is, that shows how smart we are. but it's not being smart when we're trying to get the message out there to policymakers. And so I think you see a real difference at times of evidence being produced, but going nowhere. Because of the lack of clarity and the lack of the promotion of the need for communications. But I would also answer that question saying that I think that, and I guess it's connected, that the studies that can influence political will, particularly the studies that can influence political will upstream, are the most important, and that we have to not feel as researchers somehow that if we are systematically addressing political will, somehow that's dirty, that's beneath us as researchers. It's like, my God, why are you doing the research? But to have an effect on the world. And I think often, it can be very helpful to map out, in one's general area of expertise, to try to map out, well, what could influence political will here? And then what tiny little piece of research could I produce that might contribute to that?
Yeah.
So I think it's research that's strategic, research that's, that uses the highest scientific standards, doesn't alter the science, but systematically raises the questions about how can I influence political will that will address systemic racism,
Yes,
other social determinants of health.
right. It's a myth that researchers are somehow objective. After all, we
Right.
care about the public's health, and I think we are in our work and our research questions advocating for improving health, whether we come out and say it or not.
Yeah.
One of our faculty, Bill Sappenfield, wanted to add to this conversation. He notes that many of our public health information systems and surveys capture some social determinants, but not how to measure actions to address them. How should we handle this situation?
Well, that's a great question. You know, we ought to be, you know, getting in there in the fray with, you know, suggesting questions that need to be added to the big studies that would get at the actions. And, you know, I commented several minutes ago, you know, the big questions are no longer whether social factors influence health. That was a big question when I was, you know, early and mid in my career. But, you know, they are about how it works and how to address it. But I think that's a brilliant notion to start thinking about what would it take, what could be added to, you know, particularly to the big population-based surveys that might help us get at what does work better and what doesn't. I will say, I mean, at the risk of being a little bit depressing, I mean, one of the things about you know, what's effective and what isn't, I strongly suspect that the answer is often, you know, what works better. It depends, you know, it's on the context. I don't think we have to let that, you know, paralyze us. I think we have to try to describe the contexts as well as possible so that we can, you know, sort through it. So we're not just coming out with one, you know, one associate, you know, was this action associated with better health? It's not, you know, not just that, but under these different circumstances, was it? Because we can predict that that will often be the case.
Yeah, I think we often think of social determinants of health data as data that allows us to demonstrate and document associations between social determinants, whether it's housing or education or, you know, financial circumstances and health and well-being, when in fact there are in every location many interventions that are trying to address those things. One of the sessions that we had here in this training was evaluation. And I think that's an opportunity for us to generate data about social determinants, how to address social determinants, and whether certain programs are effective or could be improved, or perhaps need to be changed, or we need to take a brand new approach to addressing those social determinants. So maybe we should begin to really be thinking about these program evaluation data as also data on the social determinants of health, really helping us to understand what we should continue to do, how we need to improve it, and what we need to stop doing. Because if our inequities are growing, then really some of the things that we are doing need to be stopped or reversed. And Bill adds that we need some groups with big brains to help define and lead this effort, to help us do a better job of measuring actions to address the social determinants of health. So hopefully some people here will volunteer to begin doing that in their states and other jurisdictions.
And I think we need to do a better job. I think you were alluding to this, Pat, when you mentioned program evaluation data, you know, that, I mean, there's all these interventions going on and data being collected on them and nothing coming out of it, you know, nothing that, you know, that gets used coming out of it. And, you know, is that something that, you know, both academics and non-academic, you know, public health people maybe should be getting more involved with, you know, can the program evaluations be made better? I suspect that often they could be made a lot better, and we might, you know, get some information from that.
Agreed. I agree. You know, one program that I've been involved in for a really long time, I won't tell you how many decades. Early in my career, I got involved in the Healthy Start infant mortality prevention program as an evaluator in Baltimore, and have been following it or being on various advisory groups for Healthy Start over time. And I think there's an opportunity to study each one of those programs almost in a meta-analysis kind of way, to really see not just, you know, now they approach it as a national evaluation, lumping all the data from all the sites together to see if it works. But I think really studying each initiative, carefully taking into account the context around the social determinants of health, and the context of those initiatives, and really understanding across each one of those localities what works and what doesn't, would be something that would be extremely valuable to help us understand what programs tend to be successful, what factors in those programs tend to drive success. And many of these programs really are about the social determinants of health. So it's an opportunity that we can take advantage of.
Right. It's a shame. It's a waste, you know, to not do that. And just maybe one more comment on that thread. You know, we need to take advantage of natural experiments. I'm very encouraged to see, you know, colleagues who are just getting so good at that, because you know, that's not easy. But let me circle back now to saying, okay, you want to study a natural experiment, but what can you expect given the fact that there are these long and complex causal chains that often play out only over decades or so? Well, the fact is that despite that, I mean, despite the fact that there are these long causal chains, it's kind of amazing. You know, people have seen effects, you know, and not just over decades of some interventions. And so I think it's like keeping a hawk eye out for the, you know, those opportunities that can be, you know, can make big contributions. I mean, I keep citing that there is this paper that Douglas Almond wrote, you know, looking at the effect of, you know, how desegregation of the hospitals in the South, how that led to lower infant mortality. It's a beautiful paper, and it's you know, and it's a very powerful, you know, it's a very, very powerful statement to be making about systemic racism. And, you know, so an example there where he was tracing the effect really in a pretty narrow time period. So I think, I mean, what I think is incredible is that if you see you may see an effect in a short period of time, you know, depending on what the cause is that you're looking at, and the circumstances. You may not see an effect And that could be because it's going to play out over, it's going to take decades and maybe generations to play out. But when you do see it, that's enormously powerful because there's such a conservative bias against, against finding an effect. So if you see it, it's there. If you don't see it, you don't know.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a really important source of information that we need to make sure we elevate in terms of visibility as source of information on social determinants. I should have said earlier that Dr. Hardeman, if you wanted to jump in here at any time, please feel free to contribute to the conversation.
Definitely, please.
Thanks. I've been enjoying listening to Dr. Braveman. I certainly will jump in.
So there's a question from Nicole Hollis, who notes that in teaching people about the mechanisms through which social determinants of health lead to disparities in health, is it best to show the causal chains and explain the links between more proximate factors like unsafe neighborhoods, stress, and stress leading to high blood pressure, and high blood pressure leading to increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, and then show the longer causal chain? Simple question there.
Right. Well, I'm not sure that I understood the question. The question is: it best to first show, like, for the part of the causal chain that you can show something on, and not wait for the whole thing? Sure, absolutely. Because then I think also what you can refer to is that there are some sort of general phenomena involved, and there's a literature to back it up, so that so that if you've connected a particular social determinant of health with with an intermediate outcome, say, and the literature connects that intermediate outcome with with poor health, in a more compelling way, but it would still be compelling to show the effect on the intermediate outcome. To definitely do that. And I think often what we need to do is we need to, filling in the dots is often what we're what we're doing, but sort of elucidating sort of relentlessly across the long causal chain, elucidating the different steps. But yeah, I think that particularly when you can show an effect on an intermediate outcome that the literature connects with bad bad outcomes, whether they be health or some other aspect of well-being, do it. That's valuable.
What I like about that question and that strategy is that in doing the longer causal chain, we remind people where some of these more immediate proximal associations, how they have come about, and that they've come about historically. And I think we need to remind our audiences about the root causes and why it's important to kind of disrupt the ongoing effects of those root causes. Whether it's ongoing effects of colonialism on indigenous populations, the ongoing effects of slavery on Black populations. And so I think reminding people about those root causes, I think, is critically important, even if we don't have immediate data available to demonstrate.
Well, and I have felt in dealing with policymakers that it does seem to be particularly compelling when you can show the chain. Mm-hmm. that how it is, it sounds very, it sounds very abstract to your average policymaker, that racism harms health. So we need to give flesh and blood to that, and it's both so that people see it and they say, oh my God, we really, this does result in, inflammation and altered immune, altered immune function, and then that leads to heart disease. It's both to show that it's more real. It's more real to them, I think, if they see the steps. I mean, obviously, you're not going to go sort of ad nauseum about all, everything along the way, but enough so that it's real, I think, and concrete. And the other thing about, I think, about tracing out the steps is that I think so. When you can do that, I mean, maybe this is related to the last point, but I see it as just a little bit different. It's like your science will be accepted more. When it's abstract, and if we just say racism damages health, and and they don't understand how it, how it works. They understand how it works when, when somebody is the victim of a hate crime, but and they've been made more aware of how it hurts, how interpersonal racism, so racial slurs, and racial slurs and innuendos, there's a literature now that connects that with the neuroendocrine phenomena that are happening. And I think it does, it's both it gives the research legitimacy, and it makes it more convincing. I also think it's like a discipline for us to think about. So what are, oh my God, what are the different steps along the way, and what, so that it's helpful in designing a study, to have that in mind.
Dr. Braveman, again, maybe drawing on your collaborations with state and local health departments. Our trainees work in those environments, and as they work with the social determinants of health, there are times when the political context presents a challenge, and either resisting addressing the social determinants of health or recognizing the social determinants of health. I'm just wondering if you have encountered that and what some advice you might have.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it takes a lot of patience, and a lot of patience and explaining and establishing the credibility, the scientific credibility of what you're saying. And then on top of that, that's not enough. It takes events in the world, occurring events like the tipping point that the George Floyd murder represented, and that coinciding with the revelations about the racial disparities in hospitalizations and deaths due to COVID. I think we've all experienced how those have somehow at least, and it may be temporary and it may be more superficial than, we would like it to be, but it looks like it opened some things up in terms for people being, what can I say, understanding more about, well, the existence of racial inequity. And, so that as a starting point. So yeah, sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you don't, in that, what you're doing, you're trudging along and you're trying to get, message across and get the health department to do something. And it's, and it's uphill. And, so if some external event comes along, that could help you, but we can't hold our breath waiting for the external event to come along. We just have to keep trudging. And I do think that it's emphasizing the science, like never let it, don't leave open an attack on the science, make it, more rigorous than anybody else's research. I mean, research that's on questions about social justice, it just needs to be more rigorous because it's going to be challenged. It's going to be challenged. And but I definitely saw an evolution over time at the California's State Department of Health in terms of a willingness to think about and act on racial equity. Quite a qualitative leap, I think, was taken, but it was over about a 20-year period. So that's hard. Having to be patient is very hard.
Okay. So if you don't succeed the first time, know that you're starting the conversation or starting the process of change. Just be patient. Okay, let's see. So you've certainly been looking at the social determinants of health for a long time. And I'm just wondering, over time, what kind of changes you have seen in the use of social determinants of health or the study of the social determinants of health, and what have been some of the more interesting trends and impacts?
Well, the phrase social determinants of health used to be, can I say, most people would have regarded it as, just terribly academic and abstract, and people had no idea what you were talking about. And so to see the evolution, I mean, this has been a very exciting thing and I think it's, it partly reflects the evolution of a body of scientific literature that has shown the impact of different social determinants of health on health, that transition from it being, academic in the worst sense of the word academic to very mainstream. Now it's very mainstream. I don't think it's necessarily outside of the health field. I mean, I think there are sort of sister fields in, public policy, social welfare, where the term is known. I wonder about, in some other related field, like in political science. I'm not up on, whether the political scientists are using the term social determinants of health, but I sure am seeing, literature from a wider range of disciplines that's talking about the social determinants of health. I mean, you hear people talking about it. I mean, we always have to be careful, those of us who live in California and specifically in San Francisco, that, are we in just a bubble and we have no clue about what's going on in the rest of the world. But I think this is not just San Francisco and not just California, where it has become mainstream. I think it's very important now to be sort of emphasizing and underscoring how racism is one of the most powerful social determinants of health. That it's an upstream. So like poverty, it's an upstream. Well, actually, poverty is a little less upstream than racism is. But yeah, so that racism as a social determinant of health, and getting researchers to consider it. And Dr. Hardeman mentioned the whole issue of race versus racism. That the tradition in the field has been to talk about race, and race is related to health, and it's toxic. I actually am starting to argue that we ought to be getting rid of the word race. We keep the word racism. We need the word racism as long as we have racism, but substitute ethnicity, ethnic group, whatever, something that has just a social meaning. But in any case, so people they see racial differences in health, and what does that do? That reinforces the racism, or that reinforces thinking that there's some underlying biological determinant. So really pushing on this, that the researchers need to use racism and not, really stay away from race unless they've got a good argument for why.
Thank you. Maybe I'll kind of open it up to both of our panelists. And I know that each of you have kind of touched on both the trajectory of the social determinants of health over time, some of the observations that you've had about how there have been significant pivots and turning points in the way in which we study the social determinants. But I want to look forward a bit, but then kind of keep it at some of the challenges that we really need to overcome if we're to really reduce these health inequities that I think we're all striving to work on here. So, if you had a magic wand, what would be some of the hardest social determinants of health research challenges that you would seek to solve at this time? And maybe I'll go back to Dr. Hardeman first and see what you have to say about that, about waving that magic wand and solving some of these tough challenges.
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is that, from a research perspective, I think, again, this goes back to a comment I made earlier in my responses, and that, changing, if I had a magic wand, I would sort of change whose evidence, right, whose research is considered to be sort of the, is going to inform how we change things. I think also, right now, from a like very practical and logistical sort of point of view, it's hard to, someone had asked a question around sort of causal, being able to make those causal links. And right now with the data we have and sort of the, the methods we have, that's really tough to do in a way that, to Dr. Braveman's point, very clearly sort of delineates for policymakers or whoever the audience is, what's happening. And so I see that a lot of that as sort of a big challenge, that if I could wave a magic wand and we could make it happen, that would be great. But I also, I want to think about this a little more, because I think there's so much, it's such a big, and I think part of it is that because it's such a big issue and it's such a challenging thing, I think we often get stuck in this, like, well, the little piece that I'm doing or contributing isn't really actually going to be enough to affect change in any way. And so then we kind of give up or, step back a little bit. And so part of it is also just waving a magic wand and kind of bending to folks' sort of perceptions of this issue, and really thinking of, getting people to reframe about, the ways that they are wanting to and able to engage in the work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Braveman, what would you like to solve if you waved your magic wand?
Oh, I would like to solve all the mysteries, but I'm not going to get to do that. I mean, it's interesting that the first thing that came to my mind when you posed that question is studies of what works in education. That I was very dismayed, I don't know, about 15 years ago, when I became aware of the fact that there's no consensus within the field of education about what works. I mean, all the things that we just assume, class size and teacher credentials and stuff, the evidence is unclear. And I think in terms of health impact, that would be, that would be huge. And not having that plays into the hands of those who would starve schools of the resources that they need. So that would just be the first answer that would come to my mind if I were to wave my magic wand.
Thank you. How about in the area of methodological approaches? Do you think we need to make some advances there, or even data? I mean, epidemiologists use data, and in some ways our hands are tied a little bit, because so much of the data we rely on is about individuals, whether it's in maternal and child health, birth records, medical records, they're all about individuals. Rarely do they contain that upstream data. So are there things that we can do there to improve our ability to kind of document the importance of social determinants of health, or identify points of interventions on the social determinants of health? Dr. Hardeman, do you want to answer that one first?
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting myself. Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about my data magic wand, that's exactly right. Like, I think, like, my dream, right, is this population health level, data repository where has been informed by scholars, by community folks across the country, and represents sort of all of the ways that we understand structural and institutional systemic racism being operationalized, right? And then leveraging that to be able to answer population health level questions, right? Versus sort of that individual level that you just mentioned. And not to say that that's not important, but I think we've gotten a lot of that, right? We understand that really well, but I think it's harder right now to answer questions that are aimed at looking at sort of how structural racism is impacting communities across the country, right? So we're trying to do that. And I just launched a study where we are looking at how communities that have experienced a high profile event of police violence over the past 15 years, we're looking at an association with preterm birth and low birth weight in those communities, with this idea that, right, that, I mean, it's a form, police brutality, police violence is a form of structural racism that, is going to impact, we believe, or, we suspect, health and well-being or preterm birth. But I think that there's so many other manifestations that need to be both, even in this current analysis I'm talking about, that need to be sort of controlled for or considered in those models and in that analysis, but also need to be part of the models or the discussions as we think about sort of the ways that all of these different things intersect, right? Because we know it's not one single issue. And that it's sort of this confluence of things that is really, and there might be something, and this is why I think pregnancy is such an important way to study this, because I have to think that, there may be something acute that happens, right? Like George Floyd's murder while someone is pregnant that can, that may sort of more exacerbate an adverse outcome in a way that maybe wouldn't have happened otherwise. But yeah, so I mean, I think we have a lot of work to do, and a lot of really, I think, exciting challenges in the data space to be able to effectively discuss how structural racism is impacting health and well-being at a sort of population health level.
Dr. Braveman, did you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. I think the key methodologic tool that we need is crystal clear conceptualization. that if we have that, then we won't fall into the trap of, as Dr. Hardeman just said, it's rarely one single thing. It is a confluence of factors that, that's almost always true. And yet we design these studies as if there's this single thing. I mean, and some of that is because we're hampered by lack of access to the information on what those other things are that are acting. But I think we need to sort of push the field further and say we're going to have to figure out methods, but if we're not conceptually clear, we won't even know what methods we need.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think I would agree with you. That's a huge challenge. I feel like it's a little bit blurry, the future and how to get crystal clear. And I think that's that is a barrier to us being crystal clear right now. But I agree. The clearer that we can be, the better we'll be able to design our studies. There is a question that came in. Let me see if I can articulate this clearly. As part of the local health department in one of the jurisdictions, racism as a public health crisis was declared. Also, across that city, there were others who declared that racism is a public health crisis. Local mental health organizations or addiction organizations have done the same. So the question is, what are your thoughts on organizations who declare this type of statement? should they come together to create a united front, I guess, instead of just one by one declaring this as a public health crisis? And if it is a good idea, any advice on getting organizations on board, and should public health be leading this work?
I can start. There's a lot. There's a lot in that question. I think, generally speaking, the declaration of racism as a public health crisis is great. I think for those of us who've been doing this work for a long time, it's kind of like, well, welcome to the party, right? And so it feels a little bit, or a lot delayed in many ways and for many reasons. I often think about Dr. Kamara Jones' incredible work, pioneering work, right? And, so this stuff has been out in literature and out in the public health space for a very long time. So on that end, it feels very frustrating, but it's also exciting, as Dr. Braveman referenced, like when there's a moment, right, you have to leverage that moment. I teach health policy. We talk about sort of how do you, when the window is open, like how do you leverage that moment, to go through the policy window, right? And so I think, that's important to do. I think where and we saw a lot of that, right, across schools of public health, across public health organizations and cities and in counties, in the past year. And where I struggle with now in this moment is that those words are there and have been put out there, but the action steps to follow them have felt, not either non-existent or incredibly hollow, right? And so, I think to the person who asked this question, one of the parts of the question was around is there a need or would there be power sort of in a collective effort, right, to name racism as a public health crisis? And I would say sure, but I feel like at this point that we've seen that, and maybe not in sort of a coordinated way, but certainly we've seen everyone from the local nonprofit to the large Fortune 500s who are making some statement around racism or anti-racism and things like that. And so I think, to me, what would be a powerful next step is less about sort of the collective power, but really about or maybe the collective power needs to be around sort of what are our action items? What are the next steps? How are we actively living this statement that racism is a public health crisis? What does that mean? And what are we doing about it?
Thank you. Dr. Braveman?
Yeah, I don't have much to add to Dr. Hardeman's comments. The hollowness, has been observed. I think it's it's unfortunate that we've had the pandemic for many reasons. I don't think that has helped. I think that the existence of the pandemic, which of course, that just draws the attention and in terms of being viewed as critical, and it is. So I think that's that's been part of why maybe there hasn't been more rolled out. But I think it's an interesting idea that if some enterprising local or state public health people wanted to develop a sort of a package of, here's some actions, responding to the recognition that racism is a public health crisis, and get that package out there, of suggested actions and tools and resources, that would be great. I'll bet the local health departments probably, they're going to act on their own. I mean, and probably the state health departments also. But to have a resource like that could be very helpful. I don't think it's going to take care of the problem, which is that the limited recognition that racism is a public health crisis, that there is limited recognition. But
Yeah.
we have to keep pushing.
Thank you. Jessica noted after you started talking that what you're naming is exactly the struggle. When it was declared, then COVID spiked and then nothing happened. So she was thinking about drawing everyone together, did declare it, and pushing them forward and holding them accountable. So I'm not sure we have time for Carol's last question, but if we make it fast, we can do it because it's 3:59. Carol Gilbert, one of the faculty, asked, what should be at the top of the to-do list? You say there, Carol, do you mean the trainees or do you mean of these organizations who are declaring?
Yeah, the organizations that are declaring, yeah.
What should be at the top of the to-do list for the organizations that are declaring racism as a public health crisis? That's our last question.
I'm willing to say something.
Okay.
About that. That they first, they have to put out they have to collect the evidence, put it out in a form that people are going to see, sort of repackaged under that. The evidence is there, but under that notion of that racism is a public health crisis, they need a sort of a manifesto, and it needs to be short. And that's that's just the first thing. The other thing that they need to do is take a look at which structural and systemic determinants of health in their area are the ones that they might, be able to influence in a reasonable period of time. To develop a strategy, to develop an action strategy that and that action strategy should be focused largely on the structural barriers, not the downstream stuff that that can be there, but that's what's usually there, and it's the upstream influences that get left out.
Thank you.
I think I would just add, I think the most critical things at that sort of starting point are some sort of power analysis. We have to understand the role that power plays, and both, public health more broadly, but also the organizations that we're all doing the work within. We need to ask, do we have the right people at the table? And if not, how do we get them there? Who are they and how do we get them there? I think the other two questions are who are we accountable to and why, right? So being very clear about that. And also, what are our values, or what do we value? And so having those questions answered at the outset, I think allows for the development of those action steps in a way that is reflective, self-reflective, and frankly, and is anti-racist.
Great, thank you so much. And we have run out of time, and I just want to thank you both for your enormous generosity in spending time with us today, sharing your incredible insights, drawing from your experiences. And for me, it was an enormous privilege to be in dialogue with both of you. And so thank you very much. And I look forward to following your ongoing contributions and boundary pushing in the field. Thank you so very much. I think at this point, I hand it over to either Ashley or Catherine or something like that.
Thank you.
Well, hi, everybody. Hope you're still going to stay with us because we wanted to have a few words, both Mike and I, just to kind of close things out. And I just want to say, wow, that really was a great panel presentation and such a great way to end the course. And with two amazing leaders in the field. And truly this, as I mentioned at the beginning of the course, this was one of the benefits of having a virtual training course, and that we just had access to so many wonderful people, both faculty and guest presenters who are truly leading experts in the field. It's really hard to believe it's been 3 weeks since I welcomed you all to the training course, and here I am thanking you all on behalf of HRSA MCHB for your participation. It's really been a full course. I hope that you've enjoyed everything that you've learned. We've talked about analytic methods for performance measurement. We've talked about needs assessment. Our recently doctored Carol Gilbert presented on PPOR. We had Michael Kramer talking about all things multivariable analysis, measures of impact. Pat Ocampo, of course, talking about evaluation, and our very own Mike Smith talking about data communications. And hopefully as many of you as could attended the roundtables that we had. I know many of you reached out to faculty with specific questions about your work and career decisions, and I'm sure benefited from the combined expertise of this amazing group. And I really hope that you'll stay in touch and reach out to us if you want to continue your conversations, or if you have any other questions. I know I speak on behalf of myself and the faculty that we're truly happy to talk to you at any time. And the course is not officially over. We will be offering post-training webinars to you, and more information is forthcoming about that, about potential topics and your preferences on those. And with that, again, thank you all for an incredible 3 weeks. I truly hope you enjoyed this course, and I'm going to turn it over to Mike Smith for some final words.
So I was going to say a lot of the stuff that Catherine said, so I won't repeat it, but do you remember when Catherine gave that opening presentation? That was back in June, right? We were so young. It seems like so long ago. And then, you know, we talked about the public health planning cycle and some of these things at the opening session of the last 3 weeks. We asked you to get together and think about developing a report or a white paper title that your whole group thinks will be beneficial or useful or interesting. And the one that was voted, that received the most votes was Race, Not Racism, Racism, Not Race, a study of social determinants of health and health inequities. And we started out talking about social determinants of health. We talked about several other topics over these past few weeks, and we ended up here talking about social determinants of health. I'm in the unenviable position of talking to you after hearing about all that. I'm thinking about everything that I've been hearing and processing it, and everything that I'm learning here too. So we don't want to keep you any longer than we need to, but I would ask you and challenge you to think about and write down some of the things from the past few weeks that have been revelations or epiphanies or eureka moments, right? You don't have to communicate them to us, just think about them for yourself, right? What are some things that you learned that you're most likely to use? What are some things that you've learned that you'd like to apply to your work? And of course, we enjoyed meeting with you here in Zoomlandia. It's not ideal, but I hope that we made the most of it, and we utilize some of the resources that we have to bring people in that we wouldn't be able to have in an in-person training. I think we've all benefited from that, but as Catherine said, it doesn't end here. All of the faculty members have agreed to be available for ongoing technical assistance. So reach out to us for the next year. We're going to have some post-training webinars. So be on the lookout for some information from Ashley about those. Share the material, anything that you've felt was beneficial. You have access to recordings, share it with your colleagues, talk about these things with your colleagues. A year from now, you're going to receive a 1-year evaluation from Ashley. And hopefully between now and then, maybe there's a chance that we could meet in person at the City Match MCH Epi Conference. If that's an in-person conference in December, we look forward to the opportunity to maybe being able to interface and talk about some of these things or whatever else you want to talk about in person. So with that, these are some possible post-training webinar topics. We don't have to do any of these, but we could do any of these. Ashley's going to send out a form that you can fill out to suggest topics, to vote on topics. There are several that we've done in the past that we have recorded, so we can make those available to you, and we don't have to repeat those same topics. But give that some thought, what else you'd like to learn about, and we can bring in some experts to talk about those things. Congratulations. This is the end of the 2021 Maternal and Child Health Epidemiology training course. And I'll leave you with just one last picture of Tumbleweed, our wonderful miniature donkey. Thank you, everybody. Ashley, anything to say as we close out?
You and Catherine covered it. I just want to say my final thoughts are just gratitude to the faculty and guest faculty for not just these 9 sessions, but all of the time that you put into planning this and delivering it and adapting it to virtual. Thank you to our panelists who are no longer on the call, but a gratitude to them, and then gratitude to you all for being a trainee and adapting and being flexible with our virtual course. And we hope to say this is our last virtual, but on Mike's point with being able to meet in person, do know that the December conference for City Match right now is a hybrid event, and we hope to have some component on site in New Orleans. So if you are there, reach out. I will be there hopefully, and network with each other and finally get to meet, find the faculty, and just continue to utilize the network that you've built here and over the next year. So just gratitude and congrats.
And you should receive something in the mail, a certificate suitable for framing, acknowledging you as someone who completed this course.
Correct.
So thank you, everybody. I can't tell you how thankful we are that you